If you've ever searched what index fund should I buy, you've probably seen the same three tickers come up over and over: VOO, VTI, VXUS. And if you're like most beginners, you've probably stared at those three letters and thought, what's the actual difference? Which one is right for me? And do I need all three? By the end of this video, you'll have clear answers to all three questions. We're going to break down exactly what each fund holds, how they've performed, where they overlap, and how to think about building a simple, low-cost portfolio with any combination of them. No jargon, no complex strategies, just a plain English breakdown of three of the best index funds available to everyday investors. Before we compare the three funds, let's make sure we're on the same page about what an index fund actually is, because this is the foundation everything else builds on. An index fund is a type of investment that tracks a specific market index. Instead of a human manager picking stocks, the fund simply buys every stock in the index it tracks, automatically, in proportion to each company's size. The result is a fund that performs almost identically to the market it tracks. If the S&P 500 goes up 12% this year, your S&P 500 index fund goes up approximately 12%. The big advantage is cost, because there's no active manager making decisions. Index funds charge very low fees, called expense ratios. The three funds we're comparing today all charge 0.03% to 0.05% per year. On a $10,000 investment, that's $3 to $5 per year in fees. Compare that to the average actively managed mutual fund, which charges around 0.5% to 1% per year and still underperforms index funds more than 80% of the time over the long run. Index funds were championed by Vanguard founder Jack Bogle, and their dominance in long-term investing has been one of the most important financial stories of the last 30 years. Let's start with VOO, the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. VOO tracks the S&P 500 index, which means it holds the 500 largest publicly traded companies in the United States. Names you know: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, Tesla, Berkshire Hathaway. The expense ratio is 0.03%. On a $10,000 investment, that's $3 per year, essentially free. Over the last 10 years, VOO has returned approximately 15.6% per year annualized. That's an extraordinary run. $10,000 invested in VOO a decade ago would be worth over $43,000 today. The S&P 500 has become the default benchmark for almost everything. When the news says the market is up 1.5% today, they mean the S&P 500. When Warren Buffett tells ordinary people where to invest, he recommends an S&P 500 index fund. In his own will, Buffett instructed the trustee to put 90% of the money into an S&P 500 index fund. So who is VOO for? Anyone who wants pure, simple exposure to the 500 largest American companies. It's the most straightforward way to participate in U.S. corporate earnings growth. Now let's look at VTI, the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. VTI tracks the CRSP U.S. Total Market Index. Where VOO holds 500 companies, VTI holds approximately 3,600. It includes every publicly traded U.S. company, large, mid, and small cap. The expense ratio is also 0.03%, identical to VOO. Over the last 10 years, VTI returned approximately 15.0% per year annualized. Slightly lower than VOO's 15.6%, but extremely close. Here's the key thing to understand about VTI. It includes everything in VOO, plus about 3,100 additional smaller companies. The composition is roughly 82% large cap, 12% mid cap, and 6% small cap. That 82% overlap is the most important number when comparing these two funds. VOO and VTI hold almost the same stocks. The 500 S&P 500 companies dominate both. The extra 3,100 companies in VTI are smaller and have less weight in the fund. Is that worth anything? Historically, yes. slightly. Academic research shows that smaller companies have outperformed large cap companies over very long time periods, a phenomenon known as the size premium. But it's modest, and it doesn't always show up in any given decade. Let me be direct about this comparison, because a lot of content online makes it seem more complicated than it is. VOO and VTI are 82% the same fund by weight. Every company in VOO is also in VTI. Every dollar you put in either fund is mostly going to the same places: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, and a few hundred other large American companies. The difference is that VTI adds a thin layer of mid-cap and small-cap exposure on top. If you believe smaller companies will outperform over the next 20 or 30 years, and there's historical evidence suggesting they might, then VTI gives you that exposure at no additional cost. If you want the absolute simplest portfolio with the clearest benchmark, the thing the news reports on every day, VOO is the answer. Pick one, don't spend more than 10 minutes deciding. The bigger risk is spending so much time comparing them that you delay investing at all. Now we get to the fund that's most different from the first two, VXUS, the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF, where VOO and VTI are entirely US focused. VXUS holds everything outside the United States. VXUS tracks the FTSE Global All Cap ex-US Index. It holds over 8,600 companies across more than 40 countries. About 75% of the fund is in developed markets, countries like Japan, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, and Australia. The other 25% is in emerging markets: China, India, Taiwan, South Korea, Brazil. The expense ratio is 0.05%, slightly higher than VOO and VTI, because international funds have more complexity but still extremely low. The 10-year annualized return for VXUS is approximately 9.8%, meaningfully lower than VOO and VTI's 15% plus returns over the same period. US stocks have dramatically outperformed international stocks over the last decade, but here's the case for VXUS, and it's a legitimate one. The United States represents roughly 62% of global stock market capitalization. That means 38% of the world's investable companies are outside the US. If you only own VOO or VTI, you're ignoring more than a third of global corporate wealth. History shows that US and international markets tend to move in cycles. The US dominated from 2010 to 2025, but from 2000 to 2010, international stocks outperformed the US significantly. Nobody knows which market will lead the next decade, and in 2026 specifically, VXUS has had a notable run, up approximately 33% in the past year. International stocks have been benefiting from a weaker dollar, strong earnings in European and Asian companies, and investors rotating away from historically expensive US valuations. VXUS also pays a significantly higher dividend yield than VOO or VTI, about 2.66% versus 1.0% to 1.3% for the US funds. That's because companies outside the US tend to pay out more of their earnings as dividends. Now that you understand what each fund does, let me introduce you to the simplest and most proven long-term investing framework, the three-fund portfolio. The three-fund portfolio was popularized by the Bogleheads community, a group of investors inspired by Jack Bogle's philosophy of simple, low-cost, long-term investing. The formula is VTI, US Total Stock Market; VXUS, International Stocks; BND, US Total Bond Market. Together, these three funds give you exposure to over 15,000 stocks and 10,000 bonds across the entire global investment universe. The blended expense ratio is about 0.05% per year. On $100,000, that's $50 annually. This three-fund portfolio has outperformed the vast majority of professionally managed funds over the long run. It requires almost no maintenance. You set your allocation, buy the funds, and rebalance once a year. Here's how a typical allocation might look by age. For investors in their 20s to mid-30s, 60% VTI, 25% VXUS, 15% BND. Heavy on stocks, light on bonds. Long time horizon means you can ride out volatility. For investors in their 35 to 50, 45% VTI, 20% VXUS, 35% BND. More bonds start to reduce overall portfolio swings. For investors 50 and older, 30% VTI, 15% VXUS, 55% BND. Capital preservation becomes more important as retirement approaches. These are starting points, not rules. Your personal situation, job security, other assets, risk tolerance matters. But as a framework, it's been stress tested across multiple market cycles. If 3 funds feels like too much, there's a single fund alternative, VT, the Vanguard Total World Stock ETF. VT holds about 9,800 companies across 47 countries. As of 2026, it's approximately 62% US stocks and 38% international, essentially VTI and VXUS combined in one fund. The expense ratio is 0.06%, just slightly higher than holding VTI and VXUS separately. So why not just buy VT and be done with it? For most people in a tax-advantaged account, a Roth IRA, a 401k, a 403b, VT is genuinely a great one-fund solution. You get global diversification, low cost, and you never need to rebalance between US and international because the fund does it automatically. However, in a taxable brokerage account, holding VTI and VXUS separately is actually more efficient. Here's why. VXUS passes through what's called a foreign tax credit. Foreign companies pay taxes to their home countries, and when VXUS distributes dividends, it passes along a credit for those foreign taxes, about 0.23% per year, that you can use to reduce your US tax bill. VT doesn't pass this credit through in the same way. Over time, the combination of lower expense ratios and the foreign tax credit means VTI plus VXUS beats VT by roughly 0.13% per year in a taxable account. On a $500,000 portfolio, that's $650 per year, not life-changing, but meaningful over decades. Let me give you a simple decision framework, not financial advice, but a way to think through this for your own situation. If you want the full 3-fund structure, VTI plus VXUS plus BND, with an allocation that matches your age and risk tolerance, here is the most important thing I want you to take away from this video. The difference between owning VOO versus VTI is tiny. The difference between owning VT versus VTI plus VXUS is small. What is not small is the difference between owning any of these funds versus owning nothing. The investors who fall behind are not the ones who picked VTI instead of VOO. They're the ones who spent years researching the perfect portfolio and never started. All 3 of these funds are excellent. All 3 have extremely low costs. All 3 give you instant diversification across hundreds or thousands of companies. The best index fund is the one you actually buy, and keep buying month after month regardless of what the market is doing. Any of these, bought consistently over time at low cost, gives you a strong foundation for long-term wealth building. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe. We break down investing concepts like this every week, plus deep dives into what's happening in the macroeconomy and what it means for your portfolio. And if you have a question about any of these funds, drop it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next one.